I think so. Great. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this meeting of the Advisory Committee of Maine's Offshore Wind Roadmap Process. We're glad to have you here. We have members of the Advisory Committee here in the Zoom screen with videos on. We also have some invited guests. I want to do a special thanks for members of Maine's congressional delegation and their staff who are here with us today. So thanks for joining. Also, we do have 35, 40 folks observing right now our meeting. We're really happy to have you with us. I'll be doing this a couple times throughout, but there is a comment portal that we have on the website that's a good place to channel comments that you have, even right now during the meeting. Those comments come in, are sorted, and are sent out to the different working groups. So I just thank you for being with us, and that'll be your way to weigh in today. Let me just drop that in right now. And while you're on that website, if you haven't been to the MaineOffshoreWind.org website, do take a look at that. Okay, so to get going this morning, I'm going to turn it over to your co-chairs, starting with Admiral Gregory Johnson. So Admiral Johnson, please, good morning, take it away.
Well, I passed the first test. I figured out how to unmute. So good. Thank you, Dave, for the introduction, and thank you to all the advisory committee members for being with us this morning. I know you're all busy, have busy schedules, and as Dave said, we're going to be listening to some of the output from the 4 working groups who have met since we had our first meeting on the 14th of July. I know that, and we recognize that all of you come to this conversation with different perspectives, and those different perspectives will make this process stronger as long as we take the time and make the effort to listen to each other. And I think by listening and by learning, we build trust and mutual respect. And of course, that always results in a better outcome. I also think that, or I know that with my co-chair, Dan Burgess, we want this roadmap process to be one that creates a future for all of Maine. And that means we need to make sure of our different viewpoints are heard and listened to, and that we come to some kind of a conclusion that's best for the common good of all. I've been involved in all manner of organizations, public, private, for-profit, non-profit. It doesn't matter if it's trying to shape national security policy, if it's on a nonprofit dealing with all manner of issues. For me, it's been, a lot of them have been associated with public higher education, or for-profit companies that I've sat on the board of. All of them, in one way or the other, have become better and made better decisions through the deliberative process. And so I'm a big believer in it. And I think that we have an excellent deliberative process set up here. We have people with many varying views, all different equities in this offshore power project that we're undertaking. But at the end of the day, we have to come together in the deliberative process. At the end of the day means that it may not be the optimum decision for me or for you or for this organization or that organization. But I'm fully confident if we work together, listen to each other, respect each other, and build mutual respect, that we'll come up with a conclusion, a product at the end of the day that is best for the common good of all the citizens of the state of Maine and the economic future of everybody in our state. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to my co-chair, Dan. And again, thank you all for being here today.
Well said, Admiral. Thank you, and I echo the thanks of for you all to participate this morning. All the work that's kind of happened in the between the meeting in July and now. I'm really excited to get into the meat of the updates and to hear kind of what's happening in the work groups. Just to echo what the Admiral said, and also just want to again recognize the congressional delegation who's joined us and is participating in the process, and want to note there's a lot of activities happening outside the roadmap process that just we can touch on more in coming meetings. But there's legislation passed and signed, which is a priority for us to implement, including creating the research consortium, which we can talk more about. We're finalizing review of comments around the research array location and application. And then within this process, have brought on a couple of consultants, both in the energy market strategy work group, as well as the supply chain and workforce work group. So we want to work on identifying gaps of where those exist for other technical study needs, but exciting to report on some of that progress, and looking forward to this quick hour. I think we've got a lot on the agenda, but I think it's, at least for me, helpful to have those these kind of interim shorter meeting updates, just so we can keep the momentum going. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, David.
Thanks so much. All right. So this is our agenda, folks. Today, we're going to be moving quickly today, but it's very interesting, and we can look across what's happening. The main part of our agenda is looking across the progress in the working groups. All the working groups have met at least once. And one of the things they've done is to figure out how to structure their work over the fall and what they're really trying to do. So we're going to have working group updates. I've asked 5 minutes each. We're going to run through them. And then we've got about 15 minutes to have a conversation about it. We're going to end our meeting today with a reflection around equity and what that means for our roadmap process, and putting that equity lens on it. It's kind of like a little teaser into that conversation. We're going to dive more deeply into that in October 6th, which is our next meeting. And speaking of that, we'll end today talking about October 6th. That's all we're doing today. And the real meat of it is going to be this look across the working groups. So we've lined up working groups. Hang on just one second. Actually, I wanted to remind everybody where we're at. I have this is my last slide here. We are at phase 1 of this roadmap development process, which goes all the way through the end of next year. And then the implementation of the roadmap obviously goes beyond. So we're in phase 1 here, and we're trying to develop initial recommendations. And we have these 4 working groups that are structured around big ideas of part of the roadmap that are developing these recommendations. Now, we use the word initial because it's not a lot of time to feel very confident about all these ideas, but we do want to show up in our meeting in December with the working groups presenting us a set of ideas on their respective subject areas. And then into next year, we'll be refining it and then consolidating all that into the actual roadmap document. We know that as we go along, some things can't wait till December 2022. And so we're going to be spinning ideas off, and maybe there's legislation or other things that need to happen beforehand. So this roadmap process allows for that. The other thing it allows for and actively seeks is proactive engagement around it. And there's some milestones where we're going to be most focused on that engagement, including after we have these initial draft ideas. There's going to be some real proactive work to go around to a diversity of folks across the state and talk about what's being put on the table and how folks are reacting to it. And we're going to do that again once we have a draft consolidated roadmap at the middle of, or sort of end of the summer next year. And there's going to be ongoing pieces of public engagement and stakeholder engagement as we go. And as I threw in the chat earlier, and I'll do it again, the website is slowly getting built out, and there's a comment portal on there that really is an effective way to communicate with the working groups, in addition to attending all these meetings. Okay, so that's where we're at. So here we go. Our first working group summary we're going to do is for the Energy Markets and Strategies Working Group. And we've asked co-chair Selena Cunningham, who's here with the Governor's Energy Office, to give us an update of how that working group is doing. And so Selena, I'll turn it over to you, and just let me know when you want to push forward on slides, please.
Great. Good morning, everyone. So just to give you an update on the Energy Markets and Strategies Working Group, we've had one initial meeting, have another meeting next week, and I'm going to walk through 5 buckets that the working group will focus on. These are the areas, in addition, that we are going to get some additional technical support to help build out. They're in draft stage, given the state of where we're at in this process. As Dan mentioned, we have an energy consultant on board. We've identified DNV as a conditional awardee for that project, and so we'll go through the steps to move that forward, which is exciting to have some additional technical support. So the 5 areas that we're going to start focusing on and have been focusing on is, number 1, the state of the offshore wind industry. So building on the work that the University of Maine has done, that others have done worldwide, in terms of really understanding where the floating market is today and where it's going over the next decades, both from a deployment standpoint, but also from an R&D and innovation perspective, as well as costs. And so getting a good understanding of those pieces to not only understand the market in general, but also specific opportunities for Maine's leadership. In addition to that, we will be looking at potential scenarios for what offshore wind build out in the Gulf of Maine could look like. And those I look in 2 different ways. One from a regional standpoint, what we anticipate overall the Gulf of Maine to look like over the coming years. We'll use information from other states and other places in order to get an assessment of what's potentially coming down the pike. And then in addition to that, looking at specifically Maine's energy needs. And this will build on the work that we've done in the renewable energy markets assessment that the Governor's Energy Office released last year, as well as some of the Climate Council modeling for energy needs. And so we'll build on that to look at a longer term outlook for potential offshore wind to meet some of our energy needs. And we'll look at both different scenarios based on the available data that we have. Next slide. The other 3 pieces, the third one is related to a socioeconomic analysis of offshore wind. And this is about identifying both the benefits and costs associated with offshore wind, and looking at everything from jobs, both in various stages of development, as well as supply chain, tourism, recreation, as well as impacts to communities, fishing industry and existing users, and environmental and greenhouse gas reduction benefits associated with offshore wind. Then the 4th one is related to deployment scenarios, so strategies for effective deployment. So as you've seen across the country, various states have taken different approaches to most cost effectively deploy and procure offshore wind. We want to look at what is possible and put forward strategies that will minimize costs and maximize benefits for Maine. And the last area is related to the transmission study, both looking onshore, where are the interconnection points, what are the implications from an onshore transmission side for interconnecting the offshore wind projects. From an offshore wind standpoint, what are the available technologies and different approaches, whether it be coordinated transmission or individual transmission lines for each project, as well as what are the environmental and marine user impacts for those different strategies. And so we'll be taking a look at various aspects of transmission through that study. Next slide. We'll be working through initial conversations with the consultant this month, and then delving into more of the analysis over the next several months. And I'll note that there are areas of expertise that are certainly in the energy working group space here. Some of these topics are also rely on input from other working groups to make sure that we have a sound and inclusive kind of approach to all these pieces. And so we'll be working with the other working group co-chairs to determine the appropriate timing and structure to get input and feedback from working groups on a number of the different topics that I went through today. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, David.
Thanks so much, Selena. Excellent. So let's keep rolling forward and do the other 3, and then have a consolidated conversation about this. Next up is our Supply Chain, Workforce Development, Ports and Marine Transportation Working Group. It's a mouthful because it's a big package of important things. Jonathan Poole from DECD is here, and one of their co-chairs to walk us through this. Jonathan?
Morning. Thanks, David. Morning, everyone. I mean, this is an exciting opportunity for the state of Maine and for everyone on this call. I think we're all enthusiastic about this topic. And I think in our working group, we've had one meeting and we've signed on to work with some consultants to help us with this research effort moving forward to help draft our recommendations. And so I just kind of want to cover the core topics that we're going to be talking about. So the first is kind of Maine's unique opportunities to participate in this sector. Maine is a maritime state as much as it is agricultural and forestry state. It's a maritime state. We have 3,500 miles of coastline to take advantage of 3 deep water ports. And so we really need to look at kind of where we are today, what assets are available, kind of the strengths that we've harnessed over the last however many years to become competent in this sector, in the marine transportation and operations sector, as well as the construction sector. And we need to develop the action plan to improve and maximize opportunities. So really looking at Maine, I mean, we are within a day's drive over highways of over 90 million people, which is hard to believe when sometimes you're sitting in central Maine, recognizing that you're within 500 miles of 90 million people. And then really looking at kind of what data do we need to inform our decision making, recognizing those data gaps and really figuring out recognizing kind of the realistic recommendations. Every recommendation we make as a working group, we want to be realistic. Clearly, there are recommendations we can make that are not achievable and timely, but we want to make sure that every goal and recommendation we make coming out of our working group is attainable in a realistic amount of time, given the broad support of the state of Maine. Next, obviously, we want to develop the work and recommendations to benefit the businesses that already exist in Maine, Maine suppliers, Maine businesses, Maine people. So looking at the standards and requirements for developers for any developments that happen within the Gulf of Maine and beyond, as how can we work with the Maine supply chain that already exists. And there's lots of great work that's already happened, as Selena mentioned, from the University of Maine's work to some of the work that Steve Von Vogt and his team have done throughout the state to develop kind of that initial supply chain database. And we continue to develop our supply chain database as we go along in this effort. And kind of the last point I want to touch on is preparing our workforce. We hear a lot kind of about the future of Maine's workforce and the future of work in Maine and what that's going to look like. And we're very fortunate to have 25, I believe, institutions of higher education, including a incredibly nimble and capable community college system and technical education system to train workers for the future of work, the next industry, the next industrial revolution. And we're feel very fortunate to have that as part of our arsenal, so to speak. I haven't talked to Matt yet, but I'm going to turn this last bullet point over to Matt as our resident ports expert to talk about this last little bit.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jonathan. So this working group is also charged with working on ports as it relates to offshore wind in the state of Maine. So I mean, I'll keep it pretty simple here. Without proper port infrastructure, offshore wind is not going to happen here. So we've been pretty far ahead and have tried to get out in front of our port strategy so far. Just working through the DOT. We were charged back in 2020 with doing a feasibility study at the Port of Searsport, which is still ongoing. And then we have another study that's currently ongoing to look at supporting ports and infrastructure for offshore wind in Maine and in the New England region. So we'll be working with the working group to get their recommendations on some of the work that we've done so far and see if they have recommendations for things that we can include because that phase 2 study where we're looking at supporting ports hasn't finished yet. So we're looking to get feedback from the working group on that. We want to talk about ways that we can utilize existing infrastructure or underutilized port infrastructure in the state. We want to talk about synergies with port facilities in the state, where we can kind of have value added things, or just try and increase the advantage that we would have at a certain site by the surrounding facilities or what's available there as far as deep water access, or large acreage areas where you could have laydown and things like that that would be appropriate for building offshore wind turbines at a facility. So those are the kind of things we're going to be looking at. Look forward to the working group's input on that, and we'll be talking about that later today in our meeting after this.
Jonathan, do you want to walk through quickly this draft work plan?
Yeah, so very briefly, stepping through this, like Matt said, we're going to confirm our work plan as a group and then do a brief summary of the port study that's been going on through DOT. On the 24th, we're going to kind of set a baseline of where we are as an industry kind of in the marine transportation world and in the offshore wind sector, and kind of the offshore wind sector overview nationally as well, to make sure that we understand where we are in the phase of development in relation to states up and down the eastern seaboard. In early October, we're going to kind of look at Maine through the whole state, kind of through our regional economies, to try and understand kind of the strengths and areas that need focus up and down the coast, not just the 8 coastal counties, but also the inland counties that could provide support in this effort moving forward. And then as we kind of move into the late October meetings and into December, we'll be really diving in to each core topic, core focus area of our work group to try and kind of form those recommendations. And then by December, we'll have our early recommendations. And again, we'll work together to make sure that these are realistic and attainable goals that we set forth moving forward.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Jonathan and Matt. Very helpful. Just let's keep moving here. Meredith Mendelson from DMR is here, one of the co-chairs for the Fisheries Working Group. Meredith, you want to walk us through what this working group's working on?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Thanks, David. So I'll just walk through some of the key things that we've identified as topics that the Fisheries Working Group will be focusing on over the next 6 months and beyond. First priority is to really think about the research array as it's been developed is front and center in the minds of the fishing industry. And so we wanted to start there. It gives us a tangible project to kind of wrap our arms around. So we've been doing some initial discussion around baseline monitoring needs, in particular, focusing on the pieces that people would like to have a longer time series of data on, thinking about existing use in that area and economic impact of a project like that, as well as the impacts to species and habitats of concern. So we'll be making recommendations regarding those topics and trying to provide some context around them as well, and bringing perhaps also other research priorities forward for the research consortium's consideration when that group is formed. From there, I think we're going to sort of be scaling up that thinking to think about baseline monitoring for commercial scale projects. So same kind of approach, but using the research array as a model and a starting point. What are the changing ways that we'd want to consider that as we're thinking about a full scale project or contemplating siting in a broader area? We've also got, and I think we're planning to think about siting considerations, criteria, standards, or framework for thinking about siting that the state would use to inform development of wind energy areas in a call should BOEM go down that road. And that could be a range of things related to regulatory structure for the state, or also things for developers to contemplate, recommendations of areas of concern that we would want to see the state be informing the BOEM process through. Next slide, please. The next one is ways that the developer community might minimize and mitigate impact on the fishing industry, and also ways that they can communicate effectively with fishing industry and coastal communities. There is a fair amount there through every stage of the development process, pre-siting, during construction, after. There's a range of opportunities for avoiding impact to fishing activity. So we think that will be an active area of discussion. And finally, cutting through and across all of these, there will potentially be, policy options, both at the legislative or regulatory level, that we can pursue that grow out of these. I think some of the work of this group, certainly, as well as perhaps the Environment and Wildlife Working Group, will be used to inform the regulatory review process that's being undertaken in accordance with LD 1619 that passed this past session, that requires an interagency review of state laws applicable to offshore wind. So it'll be kind of an iterative process there in conversation with that group. And finally, we will be using the Fisheries Working Group to help inform some of the working groups, the other working groups' efforts, particularly as they relate to gathering socioeconomic data and impacts, understanding transmission, and port studies, and thinking about the impact of that on fishing activity. Thanks, David. So just in terms of timing, we have spent a couple of meetings talking about monitoring options for the research array. I think we'll be wrapping that up in our next meeting and moving into the Gulf of Maine scale. So I think, and then moving on from there to impacts of offshore wind on fisheries, on living marine resources, as well as habitat, and kind of continuing to revise those throughout the fall. I have found this agenda to look extremely ambitious after having a couple of meetings. I think, especially because we had hoped to be able to meet in person and have slightly longer meetings in person. We are hoping that maybe later this fall we'll be able to do that, and that will help, but it does look like an ambitious agenda to get through all of this. So that's where we're at.
Thanks, Meredith. Yeah, ambitious indeed. So frustrating that we had, as an advisory committee, planned to meet in person too, and that is looking more challenging now. So let's see how this all shakes out. Okay, we've got one more to do. And here, Wing Goodall, who's co-chair of the Environment and Wildlife Working Group, will present on this. So Wing, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you, David, and thank you all of you for joining us today. We've had one meeting so far, and we have a outstanding group of experts, both in above water and below water, that represent a broad suite of stakeholders, including NGOs, universities, and state and federal government. So we have really, really good representation on the group and great expertise. One thing that's really important as we move forward is strong coordination with the fisheries group. And so you'll see some parallel topics that we're covering. And as we go through that, there's just going to be a very open dialogue between the groups. And we're going to ensure that both sides are able to know what the others are doing, and that there's a strong sharing of information between the groups. Overall, our work is going to be broken up essentially into two phases. The first two headings here represent what we're going to work on accomplishing between now and the end of this year. The first part is going to be focusing on siting considerations. So what are the criteria and standards Maine should incorporate into siting and permitting offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine to protect environment and wildlife? So once you set up those siting criteria and considerations, the next question is, well, what are your data and monitoring needs in order to ensure that you're able to make informed decisions? So we will explore the data and monitoring that Maine should pursue to help inform decision-making, build from lessons learned on the research array, and certainly we're also considering both pre, during, and post-construction. Then we'll move into our second phase, and that will be considering recommended practices for environmentally responsible offshore wind development in the Gulf of Maine. So what is the information, data, and tools necessary before projects are developed? Are there adjustments that can be made to minimize potential impacts throughout the project different phases? Next slide, please. We will also be taking a close look at the research consortium and consider from a wildlife and environmental perspective, what are recommendations for that research consortium? We will also be reviewing the existing regulations and policy and provide recommendations based on the internal review of existing and applicable state legislation, regulations, and policy. And then finally, recognizing that we do have a tight timeline and we don't have the time to sort of dig into everything that we would like to, we'll be making recommendations for future directions on other areas that should be pursued. Next slide, please. So our work plan going forward, our meetings, as Meredith mentioned, we do have a lot to cover in a short period of time. So we'll be meeting shortly to confirm the work plan and also discuss BOEM processes and state and other state experiences. As we discussed before, something that's really important is that the work that's being done here in Maine is building from and coordinating with work that is currently going on up and down the East Coast right now, because there are a lot of similar kind of working groups and exercises going on right now. We just want to make sure that we really successfully are building from those and not reinventing the wheel. By the end of this month, we'll be looking at the framework and citing criteria, then move into data and monitoring needs in October. We'll continue that conversation in November, and then through November and December, work on building up the recommendations. And with that, I'll pass it back. Thank you.
Thanks, Wing, so much. Okay, great. Wow. All right. So we did a big effort, right, in consolidating that down. It's a lot of work. That was a little bit of a data dump right there. So I apologize. I want to open it up for some questions and comments about all this. I'm going to drop the slides, but I'll pull them back up if anybody wants to make reference to a specific slide. And I see Admiral Johnson, you got your hand up. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you, David. I'd just like to thank all the presenters, Selena, Jonathan, and Matt, Meredith, and Wing, for your presentations today. I think it brought out, or at least what is a foot stomper for me, is that we need hard, quantitative, verifiable data in so many different areas. I think you have highlighted the most important ones, and that will take some time, but it looks like you're all headed in an effort that you'll be able to produce this data and hire the expertise that can help us get there. But the best way on issues that maybe that people have different views on, that may be contentious and what have you, is to have good hard data. And so I appreciate the efforts that you've taken right from the get-go on this, and be sure to let us know if you need any help or assistance in this, because we aren't going to have much luck if we don't have really hard data. And also we'll make bad decisions if we don't. For instance, just take the ports. If, you know, what do we need in terms of deep water, accessibility by land and rail, all kinds of different things. And if we have to start making investment in, and then we end up making in 2 or 3 different places, but only one of those 2 or 3 places can serve the long-term goods of the of an effort like this, we don't want to do that. And we got to get our product to market. And so I think the transmission studies are going to be critically important. And I'm anxious to see those. And there's some obvious areas where we already have right-of-ways, for instance, with gas and what have you. But I don't know what the art of the possible is, both in terms of the state of Maine's requirements. I just throw out 3 gigawatts or whatever it might be for wind power to meet our future goals, but also if it's going to go to the larger market, we still have to have the infrastructure to do that. So anyway, I think we're off to a good start, and I'd just like to, again, reiterate how important good hard data, verifiable data is in this whole process. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Yeah. Tom Welch, I see your hands up. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, thanks. It is clearly an enormous amount of work that people have committed to by the end of the year, and I'm going to suggest adding a little bit to that, and that is that as the groups gather data, begin to gather their tentative recommendations, their approaches, highlighting issues, that one of the issues that should be included in the discussion is the decisional criteria by which the particular group recommends conflicting imperatives be resolved. Because I think one thing that is inevitable is that we will encounter situations where not everyone's objectives can be achieved perfectly. And therefore making some judgment and discussion, I'm not sure agreement is going to necessarily be possible about how it is that the ultimate decision makers should be choosing among these alternatives or among particular alternatives should be made. I think would be a useful contribution once all these groups move to the stage of submitting their recommendations to the broader group.
Thanks, Tom. So really focusing on criteria for decision making would be a helpful output, if I'm understanding you correctly.
Yes.
Okay, great. When folks look at all this work that's starting up, right, it's visualized over the coming months, are there things you want to say about connections, some major gap, something you expected would happen that you didn't see in that collection? Like, if you just think about that package of stuff we saw, is there any other reaction folks have to it? Patrice, go ahead, please.
Yeah, for Selena's presentation, the energy markets and strategies, it sounds like when you're looking at the state of the offshore wind industry, you characterized it as the floating market. And I'm wondering if we could recategorize that as the deep water market so that we're not leaving out any technologies that might be appropriate and potentially less environmentally damaging. So I think our goal is to build these in deep water, not necessarily limit our options. And then I'm still struggling with the Maine energy needs versus the region energy needs. So you specifically said that you were going to assess Maine's energy needs and the longer term outlook as it relates potentially to the build out. But then I think if we're looking at transmission, that sort of brings the regional needs in, and I guess sort of like a chicken and an egg thing. I think we just sort of need to lay out that I think we're playing as part of the region. Maine's energy needs will be a piece of that, but I really don't want to confuse those goalposts. I just want to be very clear about those. So those were my two, I guess, questions, comments on your presentation.
Thanks, Patrice. I wonder, Selena or other folks who have been involved in the energy working group, if some reactions to Patrice's questions right now that you'd want to offer.
Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, I mean, I think the regional state problem is a pervasive one. I think it's fair to say that this doesn't make sense unless you approach it from a regional perspective on the energy side. Maine can neither afford, nor does it have the capacity, nor does it have the ability to absorb the amount of energy that is likely to be necessary as an economic matter if you're going to be doing some deep water wind development. So I think being aware of the relative, the Maine's needs in particular, as opposed to the regional needs. It's useful to be aware of them, but in my sense is that this is only going to make sense if Maine can view this as something which it can export, either as the technology or the energy itself. And that to the extent that picks up some of Maine's requirements, all to the good. But it really is a regional issue. And that's why the transmission issue becomes very important. It isn't enough just to get it to Maine. It's very important to get it to broader markets.
And I'll just note that there are other regional entities from an energy and transmission standpoint that are looking at solutions for interconnecting offshore wind throughout the East Coast. So this is definitely a challenge that other states are facing, and we want to address and consider options from a regional standpoint, as well as think about what it means for Maine. But absolutely, you're right that there is need to be clear about how those pieces do or don't fit together.
Yeah, I guess I would just say my read is the same as Tom's, that we sort of started this for Maine to meet its goals as set out in statute, but from an economic perspective, to get this stuff to market at an affordable rate, there's a regional component, and it ties directly to the potential build out on the water. And so the scale changes drastically. So I guess I would just really encourage you to be transparent and be clear about, it's great to solve this for Maine, but if we can't afford to sell the power, then it's an exercise in futility. And it's very misleading for the fishing industry to think that the build out might be to meet Maine's energy needs when that's really not an option. So you had those split across two bullets, assessing Maine's energy needs and transmission. And I just don't know how you consider those without combining them in some way. And clarifying that will, I think, eliminate a lot of confusion about what we're actually trying to do or the scale at which we need to do this for it to make sense. So people are very confused about that. I get a lot of phone calls. Are we building this just for Maine? Or are we building this for the region? Because both are said and they're very, very different things.
Thanks, Patrice. I'm glad you brought it up. It feels like a conversation that needs to happen and be cleared out. Admiral Johnson? Wait, hang on one second, Admiral. You're still on mute.
There. I didn't what Tom and Selena have already more or less answered the very good question that Patrice asked. And I think this is becoming increasingly fungible, and it's very hard to separate the two. We're the closest point of land to the heart and soul, or the heart of the potential of the Gulf of Maine. And so if, again, we don't control who the grants may be sold to, but they're going to have to get it to market too. And that provides economic opportunity for the state. And it, for the most part, I think will pretty much piggyback on what we have to use for our own needs and purposes. But you're right, it would be naive to think that we can separate the two, and you really can't do that. But you have to look at the whole potential market. Thank you.
And is it possible to characterize the state of the offshore wind energy market for deep water rather than being prescriptive about floating technology, so that as technologies are evolving, I mean, I've been reading more about hybrid approaches. I just think for potential ecological harm, not limiting our scope and prescribing a technology because this is going to be built out over many years. It might be that floating makes sense for the research array, but a hybrid approach might make sense for a first build out. I just feel like it's important that we're looking at anything that is potentially buildable in deep water and not resting our laurels on, where the state of the art was a year ago.
That's a great point, Patrice, and wasn't in my slides, but definitely part of the thinking. And so can clarify that in terms of language too.
Great. Don Perkins, go ahead, please.
Yeah, taking the Patrice's question and clarification and Tom's comments kind of one step higher. We oftentimes, the question about the the regional nature of energy is just, we avoid it because it brings up a state versus rest of the world tension that's just hard to navigate and hard to talk about kind of out of context. So I would encourage us to really lean right on this and work this question, talk about it explicitly, and to do it in the context of why are we doing this in the first place? We have a profound climate change challenge, and the when you look at the nature of energy transformation that has to happen over the next 30 or 40 years, the capital investment, the scale of that change is extraordinary. And so I think we need to be putting this discussion into that broader context, every time we have it, because it's, we're all grappling with, these global issues and the local impacts of dealing with them. And we just have to keep the larger issues as a frame for the discussion. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about doing this.
Thanks, Don. That seems like a good point to wrap up that conversation on. I want to share one thing before we jump into the equity, and that is just, there's a slide that we did here to remind all of you as advisory committee members that there's multiple ways to engage on these topics as the working groups kept going. One is attend the working group meetings if you're not already, if you're not a co-chair. That's where this conversation is going to be focused. Provide working group co-chairs direct feedback, right? You know who you all are now. Just feel free to pick up the phone and engage directly. Or work through Stephanie Watson here, or through Selena, or through Dan at Geo, and you can work through them. This recognizes that there's technical work that's going to be going on alongside the working group in supporting the working group process. And so we want you all as advisory committee members to feel like you can engage on that as we go along. Okay. So let's spend just a few minutes teeing up this question of equity and an equity lens in the roadmap. The only thing I wanted to say at the front end of this is we're going to use October 6th, our October 6th meeting as an opportunity to spend a chunk of time, like an hour on this, to really say specifically how will we be doing this and have a conversation about it. What we wanted to do now is sort of just get some conceptual clarity. And we've asked Suzanne McDonald to help us with this, because not only is she here in our group, she sits on the equity subcommittee for the Climate Council and has generally put a lot of energy and focus on this issue. So is uniquely positioned to give us some thoughts. I've given her the terrible task of taking 5 minutes, right, and saying some sort of thoughts, offering some thoughts about how equity can find its way into our process and must find its way into our process, and what that really means in practice, right? So it stops being a buzzword and starts being something more real and tangible for us. The subcommittee on equity for the Climate Council is a wealth of experience for us. We're going to do our own thing here in the roadmap. We're not dependent on them, but we really do value what's going on because they've been working hard on this for the better part of a year now. So with that, Suzanne, I've asked you and we've asked you to say some words about how you see equity crossing into our process and being part of it, and what that means and what it might mean really in practice. So take it away, and apologies to do this to you in a 5-minute.
It's okay. We've got more time coming. Thanks, David. Yeah, my first thing is just to say thank you to all of you, to the state and the co-chairs for making space for this conversation. It is popping up in a lot of places. Just this week, I've been on several calls with folks at the state around climate, clean energy, and equity. And so it's just really great to be seeing this taken seriously and as a real opportunity, I think, for us as we think about clean energy transitions. It might feel new and to bring in as a lens to offshore wind and perhaps uncertain and confusing, quite honestly. What does this mean? How do we apply it? Maine is Maine, we're different. I know there are a lot of questions that come up when we talk about this in our state, but I think it's just important that we make the space to have these conversations, not just because I believe it leads to better outcomes, more durable outcomes, and gets us to those carbon emissions reductions faster. But because I think actually I just would say that increasingly this is actually being required, and it's an expectation of the federal government, increasingly the state government, that these things be taken into consideration. And so feels good, but also we need to get with the program. Things at the federal level, like the Justice 40 initiative, are requiring that 40% of the benefits of all climate and clean energy initiatives are that the benefits are experienced by disadvantaged communities. And so we've got to figure out what this means. And I'm glad that we're making the space here to do this. For me personally, I think of equity as, in a basic level, my work at the Island Institute to work with communities to help them come up with their own solutions to local challenges is really around questions of who's at the table and how are we balancing impact with benefit. And communities are stuck with that all the time. And I think when we think about our whole communities, we think about who we want to make sure is not being left behind, and how we have a good process so the outcomes can stand. I've carried that into the Climate Council work that I've done as a member of the Buildings, Infrastructure, and Housing Working Group when we looked at those recommendations from an equity perspective. And as David said, to help the Mitchell Center create their equity framework for the climate action plan, and now sitting on the equity subcommittee. We just spent several hours, Dan Burgess and I, talking with the Efficiency Maine board yesterday as we're seeking to adopt equity as a lens to Triennial Plan 5, the 3-year plan for Efficiency Maine's investment. So it's there. So when it comes to offshore wind, what comes to mind? David just wanted us to put out some examples. I think you heard the working group co-chairs put out some great examples of how this is already looking like it's going to factor into the work plans. But the thing for me that comes to mind when you say offshore wind and equity typically is workforce. We see this all around us in states that are really looking at this as an economic development and workforce development opportunity, that there's a commitment to making sure that those who benefit from those job opportunities come from a diverse background. This was an important thing in Massachusetts when they passed a climate bill earlier this year. And just a few weeks ago, Mass Clean Energy Center just gave out $1.6 million in grants for equity in workforce training programs. The specific focus is on overcoming obstacles that could prevent people of color and low-income people from pursuing jobs in the industry. So it's actually it's not just jobs, it's jobs for whom. And this is this idea of what we call, in sort of technical speak, distributive equity, which is thinking about equity in terms of the distribution of benefits and costs. And the idea that to be equitable, excuse me, we're really trying to target the resources to those most vulnerable first. And so in Massachusetts, they are taking this approach, saying that historically, people of color, low-income people have been the most burdened when it comes to our current energy system, and that moving forward, there is an opportunity to change that. And that's, I think, where we oftentimes see equity show up in offshore wind. I would say for Maine, and with my background in this work, what comes up for me generally, though, is procedural equity. And that's another frame on the equity lens, and the idea that, we're talking about the equitable planning, decision-making, and implementation of work. It's really a discussion of who is at the table and ensuring those who are likely to be most impacted are there and engaged meaningfully and given voice and actually heard and are actually able to shape the outcomes of the process. It also really means that those who have been historically marginalized and typically have not had a voice, and again, have borne those impacts of the current energy systems, also have a seat at the table. So I think for us in Maine, it's very much a conversation of potentially impacted communities and individuals, as well as those who have been historically marginalized and have been left out from decision-making about things like our natural resources and energy systems. Tribal communities oftentimes will fall in that box there. So, I think what's interesting from a roadmap perspective as we move forward is just to think about permitting has all sorts of requirements for stakeholder engagement, in your EIS, and developers can make commitments, as we're hearing some of the working groups want to propose. I think the roadmap has an opportunity to do more than just sort of tick the boxes that are out there, and a chance to really dig into what we think procedural equity in the state of Maine looks like based off of the realities of our impacted communities and our historically marginalized communities. And so, I'm looking forward to doing that, seeing to what extent the roadmap can ask these questions of equity at every step of the way to create more of that procedural and distributive equity as outcomes of this work. So yeah, looking forward to digging into this and seeing what this all means for us. And I would just say, if you're just not really sure, we're all learning. And, you know, I think what David and the team will likely do is bring this frame, bring this lens, and bring these prompts that we can ask ourselves and learn. We don't have to know all the answers right now. I just think it's important that we're making the space to have the conversation. So thanks.
Thank you. Fantastic. Thanks, Suzanne. That was really helpful. And as Suzanne mentions, the key thing for us as we're helping to design this is, what are those prompts? What are those questions we need to be asking ourselves as we go? And that's what we're going to talk about October 6th in more detail. And also ahead of October 6th, we're going to be sending out some information with some ideas around those prompts, those questions, as well as experience from other states. Suzanne mentioned Massachusetts, New York. Other states have been doing some very specific things around equity and offshore wind. And so we can provide some of that detail. And finally, we're going to ask you to answer some questions. So stay tuned for a little survey on this as well, so that we show up October 6th for that conversation already with some pre-input, because we just don't have time. It's 9:57 right now, so we don't have time for discussion about it. Okay. Thank you, Suzanne, for doing that. Thanks for prepping it up. I look forward to this on October 6th. I think it's going to be really interesting. And the working groups are clamoring for clarity. So we, as an advisory committee, need to start to provide that clarity, and we can do that at the beginning of next month. Okay. Final thing, speaking of October 6th, we expect to do a handful of things on October 6th, probably going to be still Zoom, folks. I don't think we're going to be in person unless there's some miracle turnaround on what's happening with the virus. I'm dropping in the chat the kinds of things we think we're going to do on October 6th. We're going to have that equity conversation. We're going to talk a little bit more about stakeholder engagement and how that's going forward and will go forward. We're going to do quick updates on working groups, but I think there'll only be a meeting or two in between, so there won't be a lot. We'll hopefully give you some guidance about what a recommendations template might look like, so there's some common shape to the recommendations that are coming into you in December. And it's also an opportunity to do some shared learning around a topic. Together with that equity survey, stay tuned for a little survey to answer about what would be a really compelling set of conversations that you would want to learn about things together as an advisory committee. That's October 6th. That's all that we had for you all today. I'm going to ask Dan and the Admiral if there's any concluding remarks that you'd like to say to help us finish up on time today. Admiral, go ahead, please. Hang on one second, Admiral. You're still on mute.
I'm a slow learner. Thank you. I just want to say thank you to everybody who participated today, advisory group members, the working chair, chairs, and the presentations you gave. I think you're well into the work and going in the right direction. I want to also thank Suzanne for your contribution today. That's very helpful and will certainly shape our thinking as we prepare ourselves for the October 6th meeting. And David, as always, thank you for the great work you do in moving these meetings along and preparing for them. And I'll turn it over to Dan.
I just echo my thanks, and hopefully folks find this format helpful. And I think feedback on, obviously, we have the October 6th meeting, but if more kind of interim check-ins like this are useful, I think it's good to flag that too. So thanks, everybody. Have a great day and enjoy the weekend.
Have a great day. We'll be posting these slides very soon, so stay tuned to look online for the posting of these slides so you can look at them over. Take care, everybody. Have a great day.